Hello everybody and welcome to Eddie Hurst's podcast version of The War of the Worlds. It's me, Eddie Hurst. Ooh, watch it. Hey! Oh, oi oi, ding ding! That's to say that I am on a bike. You can hear the bike noise in the background. I'm not actually on a bike. I did record this whilst riding my bike, and then I listened back and look, have a listen. Here's it. Can't hear a thing of me saying anything. Wasted time. So imagine I was on a bike, and the reason why I'm doing this as if I was on a bike is because, here's a fact for you, when H.G. Wells wrote War of the Worlds, he spent a lot of time going around the southwest on his bike, which is where he gets such an accurate description of all the geography of the area, because he was actually going down the pathway of the Martian. So that's some... Whoa! Imagine a stick went past me head there. Maybe an angry goose. This is a little bit of a break from the narrative proper, because I've got a fantastic interview with Subhadra Das. Subhadra is a writer, comedian, historian, and museum curator, and she has a fantastic podcast called Living with Eugenics that I would really recommend you go and listen to if you're more interested in this topic, it runs rampant in a lot of H.G. Wells's work, and I think we're starting to see how it comes into War of the Worlds in a way that isn't as direct as some of his other work. Anyway, Living with Eugenics has been super helpful for me in educating myself about the ideas that H.G. Wells would have been sort of grappling with at the time that he wrote this book, and I'm very appreciative for Subhadra, with all of her knowledge, to take some time out of her life to help talk about eugenics, to yet again try and understand a white man, which I really hope that that's not your takeaway from the conversation, just trying to understand HG a little bit more. But it's important to understand that these ideas were around, and he subscribed to them and thought about them, so we can't just sweep them under the carpet. We shouldn't just sweep them under the carpet. So get ready for that. It's going to be great. We talk about more or less the whole history of eugenics is condensed here. So I don't know if for some reason somebody's been brought to listen to it, but oh, hang on. You can hear my voice just about here. Terrible, absolutely useless. So we're about to jump into it now. Is there anything else I should say? Yes, listen to her podcast, as I've said. Also, you can follow her on Twitter. She is at Little Gaudy, which is Little Gaudy. And also, if you don't already, please subscribe, like, share, tell people about the podcast. The reviews and ratings do really help. This week, we were not only the #1 podcast in Bermuda, we're still in the Netherlands, which is ace. We're up in the in the sci-fi charts of Italy. It's great. Thank you so much for listening, guys. I hope you're enjoying it. Also, if you want to see me perform comedy in a way that isn't just exclusively based around Victorian sci-fi, I am in the finals of the Musical Comedy Awards. 23rd of August. That's at the Bloomsbury Theatre in London. But wait, what if you don't live in London? Well, unlike me, you can live stream it for only £5. If you go on the UCL website and you put in the code MCA5, you can pay £5 for it, and you can vote as well. You could vote for me if you want. Come on, do us a favour. I ask for very little in this podcast. It's not like a parent thing. That feels like such a parent thing to say. Anyway, guys, without further ado, let's get... Oh, here, hold on. This bit is actually quite clear for me saying bye, so brace yourself. Follow me on Twitter at Eddie Hurst, Facebook, Instagram, the same thing. Thanks very much. See you for the next chapter. Anyway, guys. Oh, God. Oh, nearly fell over. Seriously, right. Right, let's get into the podcast. Okay, bye. Subhadra, it's great to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us. Could you introduce yourselves? Because apparently you are a collective now. Congratulations for me giving you that.
Thank you. No, I will take them on board. Well, no, it's multiple things, isn't it? So I'm a historian, I'm a writer, I'm a curator. Sometimes I'm a comedian. Don't expect me to be funny here. It's fine. I'm happy to be serious. I do all kinds of things to do with the history and philosophy of science, and particularly to do with the history of scientific racism and also the history of eugenics.
Absolutely, which makes you the perfect guest to have on. As I'm sure you're never sick of people asking you to come on and talk about the horrors and atrocities of the early 20th to mid-century.
Oh, well, it used to be an occupational hazard, and now it just turns out I've been accustomed to it. It's what I do now.
One of the things that I listened to before I've had you on for this is the your UCL podcast episode that you did, which is amazing. I'd really recommend for anyone listening to go away and listen to that, because it's such a great look at what eugenics actually is and how you can get your head around it, because there isn't, as you say in that, there's not necessarily one definition of it. And also about how it affects even nowadays. I've listened to a few things to try and educate myself around it, and I found yours like the best of them.
Yay.
The way that you describe racism in that is it's like a single sentence, but really changed how I thought about it in a particular way. That I'm going to misquote it, but racism is the idea of superficial features of a person denoting abstract qualities about them and sort of biological abilities, which I feel like in the early noughties, and me growing up in like the 2000s, there was sort of this, I guess, the idea of of PC as a thing. And it was kind of, I feel like the definition of racism distorted into somebody being proactively, aggressively against. And I just don't, I don't know. I hope and I feel like the conversation is changing again.
I sympathize with that really, really strongly. And it's kind of like a double whammy, right? Because I was non-white working in a predominantly white institution. And so much of that early discourse, I say early, is like, I grew up with conversations about race being this kind of weird feedback loop of contradictions, which is racism is bad, but there's no such thing as race. Racism is bad, but there's no such thing as race. And they kind of circle around each other. And it's like, well, how are we talking about it then? If there's no such thing, why is it such a... And so it was that disconnect. It was the understanding that racism affects people's lives as we live them, that there is inequality, there is inequity, there is discrimination, there is prejudice, there is hideousness that happens. If that doesn't, but if the idea that it's centered upon isn't real, then how have we got here? And for me, a lot of learning about the history of race, learning about the history of eugenics, and particularly the science kind of aspect of it, to me was like such an eye-opener. So I completely sympathize with that. We just don't talk about it. And, my position is always our inability to talk about race in a meaningful way is the thing that is keeping us racist. How can you confront a thing if you can't even describe it, if you haven't even got the words to describe it? The scientific construction of race as an idea was that you can tell everything you need to know about a person by looking at them. Their abstract traits, things to do with their character, their intelligence particularly is a really important one with eugenics, and also to do with their behavior. And I say race is a broad church. And I say that because of the ways in which I know about how eugenics came about and how the frame of eugenics was applied to how we think about humans, which is to do with this idea of normal. What Francis Galton, who's the guy that came up with the word eugenics, and other social Darwinists like him, the goal that they were working towards was an idea of a normal human. And that was a racialized ideal to a certain degree. It was a gendered ideal. It was an ableist ideal as well, because inherent in it is these ideas to do with intellectual superiority, is to do with racial superiority as well. So there's a lot going on. And whenever someone says, can you just give us a quick description? It's like, no, it's the whole of our lives. Everything we know about people and how we interact and how we look at them is within this eugenic frame.
So that sort of ideal man, I guess that's where stuff like the supermensch within Nietzsche, and then, well, maybe
Yes,
not Nietzsche,
exactly.
but what Nietzsche says, and then the Nazis go, oh, that's something, innit? Let's work on that.
Totally. And it is Nietzsche as well. It's to do with this conceptualization of supremacy. So eugenics is also the science of white supremacy. And I think the important thing with the Nazis is, again, the discourse has been limited, right? So in the same way we had that feedback loop with talking about race, when we talk about eugenics, everyone's like, right, well, the Nazis did that. We know it's bad. Job done, finished. Nazis didn't pull their ideas out of the air. The Nazis pull their science out of really well-established British, American, European science that's happening at the end of the 19th century and into the beginning of the 20th.
Yeah, and even
it's all connected.
It's worth saying as well that even the concentration camps were a British invention from the Boer Wars, which did influence H.G. Wells when he wrote about War of the Worlds. Wow, Eddie, what a great seg!
That's that. I did not know that. That is a really good seg.
It's a funny. So one of the narratives that I've been struggling with throughout this is, was H.G. Wells a proper wrong-un or not?
Yes, the tally sheet approach to
Yeah, of course.
historical figures, right? Yep.
Yeah, the dignified PhD title.
Mm.
H.G. Wells, wrong-un or kinda, but heart in the right place.
Yeah.
And it's tricky. Because on the one, it's what I find the weirdest thing about reading War of the Worlds is that, and I've not invited you on as an expert on War of the Worlds, so don't worry.
This is a relief.
Is that the book fundamentally is against being invaded, and it is against the idea of something else coming over and colonizing you. And it was based on a sort of twist off of the colonial invasion stories of that time.
Yeah, I think it's a good connection, because I have to admit, it was like when I knew it was War of the Worlds, as opposed to, for example, his book Time Machine, or even The Island of Dr. Moreau. There are other bits of his work where I was like, it's easier to draw that connection. But yeah, the colonization, or the fear of colonization by this other race, this alien, literally an alien race in this book. But I think that kind of fear to do with being taken over or being somehow like biologically weak is I think the thing that I would pick up on there in terms of Wells and his eugenic views.
He is a strange one in terms of eugenics, because he was taught by Huxley, and he was in the same circles as Galton, who, of course, has appeared in the podcast before.
Yes.
Not an interview for. That'd be very tricky. And also, I don't think I'd have him on. I guess a good place to start is the idea of eugenics becoming a thing is at the same time as H.G. Wells was a student. So for him, it was cutting edge science. Genetics and eugenics. So, like I said, he was taught by Thomas Huxley, who is Darwin's described as Darwin's bulldog, I think, often. How does eugenics happen out of what Charles Darwin says?
Okay, so let's go with Darwin first. So yes, Darwin makes a really, really important, arguably is the second out of three of the biggest ideas in the history of Western science. And the Trinity is Newton, Darwin, Einstein, right? That's the size of this idea that he comes up with, which is actually a relatively simple idea. But the trick of it is the ways in which it was read and the context in which he was coming out of with that idea. And this is always the thing that I'm trying to train myself to be mindful of, is why was Darwin interested in evolution as an idea? And part of the reason is because it was the science of the time, it's the ethos of the time, it's the big scientific question, this thing to do with the species question. What defines a species in biology? And the various answers to that question in Darwin science at the time encompass also ideas to do with different so-called races of man potentially being a different species. And there's sort of a lot of scientific validity given to this as a thought process. Can we demonstrate, for example, that white Europeans are a completely different species from Australian Aboriginal people, for example? There's a scientific question involved, but there's also very clearly and obviously a political question involved, because this is the height of the British Empire. Britain has been making money off the profits of slavery for a very long time. A lot of the argument in the US then descends into how can we continue to justify slavery? And one of the ways in which we might be able to do it is if we can say, actually, you know what, Black people, they're somehow subhuman. It's okay to treat them like this. So none of these scientific ideas are happening in a vacuum, which is self-evident. Scientists are human beings. They're socialized. Their ideas come from the society of their time. And what happens to Darwin's idea, Darwin is anti-slavery all the way through his life. He's brought up by abolitionists. Interestingly, his cousin Galton is brought up by the strange Quaker arm of the same family, who are gun manufacturers.
Quaker gun manufacturers, wow.
It's an interesting contrast, isn't it? Credit to the Quaker community, they were not well looked upon because of this, and not just because of the inherent violence of guns, but Galton and Farmer guns are the guns that are most often traded in exchange for enslaved African people.
Oh, wow.
So that is how the family made their money. is they're ironmongers, right? Which sounds really innocuous, but ironmongers are the ones who make the muzzles, the shackles, the chains. Then they make the guns that are exchanged for enslaved people. And then as the abolition of slavery comes around, the family are like, how can we continue to make money out of this scenario? I know, we'll become bankers. So that's what they do.
Right.
I've gone off on one because I always talk about Galton.
Also, bombshell for me. I didn't know that they were cousins.
They are first cousins. Wow. So they share a grandfather in a man who you probably have heard of, Erasmus Darwin, who is Charles Darwin's grandfather, wrote Zoonomia, writes about the sexual life of plants, is really like a famous scientist and part of the Lunar Society, intellectual bridge between the Enlightenment, Industrial Revolution, all that kind of thing. This is the milieu in which they're both being brought up. Some people, geneticists usually, will make a point of saying they were half cousins because Charles is Erasmus's grandson by Erasmus's first wife. Francis Galton is his grandson by his second wife.
Right, okay.
No one, first of all, this is really complicated, doesn't really matter. Yeah. No one in their day made that distinction. No one today really makes that kind of distinction. No. But I do find that sometimes if I will almost put money on the fact that if someone describes Francis Galton as Charles Darwin's half cousin, they're going to be a geneticist, because it's just part of their metaphor of, it's like, let's not taint Darwin with this word eugenics association.
That's it. Like even as I've been researching in academic papers, the idea of where eugenics comes from in terms of Darwinism and social Darwinism, he often doesn't seem to be included all that much in the ideas of it.
So he and Galton, Darwin was 13 years older than Galton, and Galton really looked up to Charles Darwin as a model. And if you look at both of their lives, there's lots of similarities. So they're both explorers, they both go around the world, they kind of find their science a bit later in life. If you're going to make a distinction between the two of them, I think the main thing about Darwin is that his inherent kindness. He is a kind human being. But nonetheless, Galton's ideas, let me go back to answer the question that you asked me like half an hour ago. Darwin's theory is that mutations within individuals are favored by particular environmental changes. And then, so that idea gets branded in this really fancy way as survival of the fittest, which is what the economist Herbert Spencer coins the term as. And Darwin was perfectly happy to use that phrase. Right. But if we're going to go back into this context of what that phrase meant, Darwin means it in the sense of those individuals that are most fit to the environment in which they are living. But social Darwinists co-opt the meaning of that word fit to suggest a sort of a generic or a standard level of fitness. Right. So the fitter that you can be, the greater your chances of survival. This is the Galton genius applied to the Darwin genius idea. Right. What Galton says is we've seen from Charles Darwin's book that humans have been exercising, selective breeding on cattle, on dogs, on pigeons for millennia. Why not do it with people? That's his genius contribution and his idea of eugenics. And they both kind of, they were in close correspondence. They communicated with other fairly often. And you can see Galton's influence on Darwin in the book Descent of Man. If you read their things, they are feeding off of each other in terms of their scientific ideas. Right. So Darwin is there. He's interested, and he does actually agree at some point that the government should intervene as far as first cousin marriage is concerned. So of course, Darwin famous for having married his own first cousin, and a lot of their children died very young, and he was concerned that there was some sort of racial genetic reason for this happening. So he did believe in government intervention in marriage, but he was definitely he took a hard line on the sterilization line, or he believed that we should be kind to people is the difference. Whereas Galton was like, no, we need to be a lot more systematic about how we're doing this.
How's eugenics connected to the way that we think and engage with the world now?
Well, let's go back to that kind of normative idea. When Galton says, we need to have more systematic ways of the government intervening in who does and doesn't have children, he's got concerns about the degeneration of the British race as he was seeing it. That's part of his, and that is that's the time machine concern, right? Which is like you've got you've got wealthy upper class people, and they're not having enough children, and they're getting soft. Whereas you've also got this rising underclass, as he would have seen it, working class people who are inherently, as Galton sees them, venal, criminal, intellectually disabled, all of those things. That's what his concerns are. Short answer to why that's still with us is that's still kind of how we think about people today. We are an inherently racist society. We know that. But we're also an inherently ableist society. The way in which we perceive the contributions of disabled people, whether they are physically disabled or whether they have intellectual disabilities, is somehow that they're not contributing to our society, that somehow they are deficient, right? It's the fault of the individual, that we see it as something wrong with them, right? Whereas if you look a bit wider and a bit more equitably at the structures and inherent inequalities in our society, there's a different way to look at the world.
Yeah, it's kind of with the disability thing, it's even the word disabled is that the individual is disabled rather than, like if you were to look at sort of probably one of the easiest ways to imagine a disability for somebody is in a wheelchair. And so it's, I need disability access. It's like, well, you could have just put a ramp for
Anyone
everyone
can walk up
instead
a
of stairs.
Exactly.
And you've made a situation that is accessible for everyone. Instead, you've decided to say, no, that person needs something else.
And this is where, if you'll indulge me for a second, this is where that idea of race as a broad church, that normative view. So it applies to race, it applies to ability, it applies to class, right? So it's like our idea that somehow working class people are not contributing to society, that they are a drain on resources, or, that they are benefit cheats, or all of those sorts of stereotypes. And actually, when you look at the legislation, the fact that they're saying if you have more than 2 children, you're not going to get more benefit off the back of that. That's a eugenic policy. That is dictating, or it's not the same thing as sterilizing people or locking them up, but it's still making the same sort of statement about who should and shouldn't be having children.
An economic sterilization in a way.
Kind of, yeah, exactly. It's all entirely with us. It's in the way the government works. It's in the ways in which we govern ourselves. It's in the ways we think about ourselves as well. Sometimes you might think of your value as a citizen being dependent on, how much you are able to produce this eugenic frame.
And the eugenics has a connection to capitalism in that sense.
Inherently, yes.
Because it's sort of using science to try and justify the capital imperial system.
That's such an important thing you've said about the power of science. So science is ideology. Eugenics is one of the most poisonous scientific ideologies that has ever existed. And to me, that's why, again, this is something I was trying to be mindful of, is be able to strike a balance. Obviously, it's good that we have modern science, rational approaches. I'm just recovering from my first COVID vaccine. I think Wells really understood that. He understood the appeal to the authority of science. So one thing to note about him particularly is that he was also, just in terms of your tally sheet, he was a member of the Eugenics Education Society.
Oh no.
I'm so sorry.
Oh no. Right, let me put that on. That's going on the bad side.
So these are the people who are lobbying, at the turn of the 20th century. They're the ones who helped to get the Mental Deficiency Act of 1913 passed, for example, which means that we were locking up people with intellectual disabilities.
And he was, at that time, he was also, or maybe later, friends with Winston Churchill, who was not less than ideal in terms of race and disability relations.
Will not get me drawn on the question of Churchill, because that is where the hate mail comes from. Sure. But actually, and I would say their politics is actually quite different, right? Because Wells is fairly left, I would have thought, in terms of his kind of political thinking. Churchill, definitely not. This was the broad appeal of eugenics as, again, a scientific concept. So regardless of where you sat on the political spectrum, eugenics the science was going to be the thing that was going to save us.
Another thing with Wells to say is that he did then speak out against it. And, he did have debates with Galton where he said, you're wrong. And I think slightly earlier, so there was, I mean, you will know this much better than me, hence why I'm asking you this. But there was a time where the scientific community started to say, eugenics, we should probably not. So what happened where we started to realize eugenics is a pseudoscience? How did that happen?
It took a while. And it's most of the advances in genetics as a science in the 20th century. So I think a lot of people kind of frame it as, Galton is the seeding of his own, the ideas he seeds are actually his own unseating, as it were. Because he sets up the foundations of modern genetic science, and through modern genetic science and understanding how genes work, we understand that physically that selective breeding of humans to do what he wanted to do would be impossible. And we're not necessarily genetically diverse, so all humans are humans, but we're not necessarily genetically manipulable kind of in that way. So the vision of what Galton was wanting to happen and other eugenicists was wanting to happen, that successive improving of the human race from generation to generation, wasn't going to be possible. But in terms of, and there's still, if you read Angela Saini's book, for example, Superior, The Return of Race Science, she makes the point that there are plenty of scientists who still around today who have yet to reject the idea of race or eugenics as a viable scientific option. I think you will also get a lot of people who know way more about genetics than I do, who will make arguments along the lines of, well, but what about things, we need to think about things like Tay Sachs disease, for example, which is a heritable disease that has been almost entirely, I think, removed from Jewish communities where they knew that it was a heritable disease in those communities. So, those sorts of ideas about, like, can we think about the positive benefits of selective breeding kind of along those lines? The thing that I'm always mindful of about that is the sign. I'm not going to be able to name the people now because I only ever remember the story for how horrific it is. But an American scientist who thought that the solution to breeding out sickle cell disease in African Americans, the best thing to do would be, if they were carriers of the gene, would be to tattoo them on the forehead so that they could see other people who were also carriers and then choose not to have children with them.
Oh.
And this is what is the problem. The science never stands on its own. But there's also, like, political things that are happening. For example, like the 1950 UNESCO Declaration on Race, which is the scientific community coming together in the aftermath of the Holocaust saying this should never be allowed to happen again. But the trouble then becomes is, like, those sorts of political arguments don't necessarily satisfy scientists. Scientists like to be able to prove a thing for real. And the genetics has done that. But to me, the slipperiness is between, where those two things exist.
Especially with War of the Worlds, genetics plays a huge part in the way that he thinks about the Martians, because they're these creatures who, basically, the best way to think of them is they're an octopus with a drum on the back of their head for an ear, but gravity on Mars is a lot lighter, so they find it really easy to walk there, whereas here they're super heavy and clunky. And they've got a strange beak thing. And the idea is meant to be that they look nothing like humans, but they are as intelligent, if not more so, than us. They're just adapted to a different planet. And I think that's, he's playing with that idea of species will change and look different. Survival of the fittest, as in best fit for the area that they exist in.
Part of it, I think, is, in terms of eugenics, is that whole nature-nurture question that is inherent in the question that Galton starts asking in the 1860s, which is, which of these has an effect on who people are? And he comes very firmly down on the kind of the nature side of it. So if we were to look at other aspects of Wells's work, Island of Dr. Moreau, for example, playing with these concerns about degeneration, but also concerns about mixing, which from the standpoint of the idea of race is an interesting one as well. This idea of miscegenation is kind of one to think about. And there are other, I think probably the more recent examples of eugenics kind of being a concern since Wells are people like Ursula Le Guin, who I think the short story, I'm going to get the title of the short story wrong now, but I think it's called The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. Which is ostensibly, it's a thought exercise of a short story of a morality exercise set in a eugenic world. And the response to that is N.K. Jemison's The Ones Who Stand and Fight, which is again describing a utopian society, but where the idea of race is actually really foregrounded. And N.K. Jemison has written and spoken quite eloquently about how ideas to do with race really informed quite a lot of the science fiction that was being written in the first half of the 20th century. People like H.P. Lovecraft, for example, absolutely hideous racist.
Nightmare. Even racists thought, oh, you're a bit racist.
Yeah, it's bad. It's bad when the other racists are like, oh. And I think these ideas to do with, alien races, other species, concerns about power, and this is, I guess, War of the Worlds is part of that, as well as like who's going to win, who's going to be in charge. Are we? Do you talk about the ending? Are there spoilers allowed?
Yes, of course. Yes.
So the reason why I think that is interesting is because that's sort of a statement about their weakness as a race, right? They are racially, as a race, as a group of people who are defined by the way that they look, even if that is a very extreme definition of aliens with a drum on the head, etc. That they are, that this is what their weakness is, and Wells being with his eugenic leanings, and yes, Huxley had this idea of sort of ethical eugenics, it was about kindness, it was about be doing this as uncruelly as possible. And Galton was the same way as well. He's like, what nature does in a cruel and hideous way, I'm paraphrasing him, he said man can do in kind and quick ways. But what they're ostensibly talking about is euthanasia. Well, they're talking about compulsory sterilization. All of the science fiction that I have not read, but this concern about power and this concern about who gets to decide, because I think this is the cautionary tale with eugenics, if there was going to be one. Say the science was possible, and we know it isn't. The reasons against doing it are because those definitions of who is superior are so arbitrary and based on existing power structures. And I think, to me, I say I'm not a science fiction fan, big Star Trek fan. And so,
hey, what's not to like?
Entirely.
I mean, other than some certain episodes, because
yes, nobody is perfect.
Look, there's a lot of episodes that don't. It's just the nature of something that's been going on that long.
And also I should also point out that original series and also next gen, and that's kind of where I draw the line. But the original series, eugenics is a running storyline throughout a lot of the original Star Trek series. Right. Concerns about I'm going to end up misquoting a bunch of stuff and misrepresenting a bunch of stuff, but I think Gene Roddenberry had grew up in a time where eugenics was kind of like the main mold of how society was going to work. A lot of the stories that he tells through the context of this one spaceship is about addressing, first of all, inherent inequalities, things like racism, but also trying to project and think about what this looks like in practice. So actually, I think science fiction has a huge amount that it could potentially do, because it's like playing out these scenarios before we have to live them. But maybe, as is probably more the case, as we can see with Wells, is that he's more of a reflection of the current science and the current attitudes of his time, rather than necessarily projecting them forward in any kind of way.
It's interesting that reading Wells's not autobiography. I mean, you can if you want. He does start to, and obviously, later in his life, he does actually create work that goes towards the Universal Bill of Human Rights and things like this.
Yeah, except in fairness, yes.
But he's still initially, and in his most influential work, and the work that has inspired more people, played with that idea of power, and also of the underlying idea that there is an other, there is something else that exists that is worth being scared of. Look, thank you so much for being on. It's been amazing to speak to you and to sort of get a sense of clarity. I think we're stepping towards clarity of understanding positives and negatives of the work, and what is problematic about it, and also what that reflects in the world. And I feel like should put a full stop at the end of this somewhere. So I have.
Oh God! Oh, nearly fell over.